My name is Martha Lee. I live in a narrow house in a quiet corner of Virginia where the dogwoods bloom lazy and loud in the spring, and the weekend traffic sounds like someone stirring a pot 2 neighborhoods over. I'm 64 now, and most people in town know me as the woman who keeps fresh coffee on the church table, who signs up for the PTA bake sale because somebody has to, who can fix a hem faster than a radio can warm up. But what most people don't know, or don't ask, is that I'm the kind of woman who learned how to stand still when the world runs away. My husband, James, was a soldier. He wore uniform for a living and a solemn kindness for everyone else. He wasn't a man of many words, but he was a man of steady hands, hands that could coax a stubborn engine into life or hold a newborn like it was something holy. He came home from duty after a tour in '92 and married me 2 years later in a church where the steps had seen 100 couples promise themselves to one another. We had one child, Michael. He was a bright, stubborn boy who liked to tear apart his toys and put them back together, often with one piece too many because he liked the challenge. When James passed, heart disease, sudden and clean in a doctor's room that smelled like lemon polish, something in our house shifted and rearranged itself to fit around the absence. Grief is a kind of architecture. You learn which rooms will hold sound and which will swallow it. I kept the house. I kept the flag we'd flown outside and the dented toolbox James had carried since he was 19. I kept Michael, who, for all his rough edges, was my compass. Michael grew into a man who liked order and rules and the kind of loyalty that will make you fight for a stranger but forget to pick up a call from your mother. After high school, the military made sense to him. He said it would give him purpose and teach him to be disciplined in a way college never had for him. He enlisted and did his time. He spent a few years stateside and then volunteered for deployment overseas. He was good at it. He came back with medals and a quiet that made him more serious than before. When he told me he was re-enlisting for a longer tour, I stood in the doorway of my kitchen and let him tuck his hair behind his ear like a young man, and I tried to practice being proud without being worried. Pride, I discovered, is a fragile thing. It's easy to wear until the thing you're proud of starts to live in a world you don't understand. After his first 2 tours, Michael started calling less, at least for the kind of calls I used to love, the ones where he would ask about the pepper recipe or complain about the neighbor's dog. At first I accepted it as a result of his busy life. He was in a different time zone, his days were another person's nights. He would send a postcard sometimes, a lousy picture of a place I'd never been that made his writing a little more cramped than usual. He would say, "Mama, don't worry," and it sounded like the kind of sentence a son says when he doesn't want his mother to see that he's afraid. When the wars became longer and the returns rarer, something else came with them, a stack of letters that smelled like sand and machine oil, and a quiet that settled in my living room like dust. On one postcard he wrote, "Mama, I'll be okay. Tell Mr. Harlan I fixed his gate when I get home." He always had that way of making ordinary acts feel heroic. But it was the calls I began to miss most, the ones you can't fake, because there are conversations you only have at a kitchen table with a voice you recognize. It was after his second overseas tour, maybe 3 years in, that I started noticing the real change. He used to phone when the sun was just climbing. He used to say, "Mama, the coffee's on, I'll be home next week." Then the calls came at odd hours and lasted shorter. "Hey, Mama," he'd say, voice tight, background noise low and machine-like. "I gotta go." I would listen to the beep of the line and pray and make soup and wait for the next time. The word PTSD was one I'd heard on the news, something abstract and far away, until it walked into my living room and sat on the sofa like it belonged. He called me once from a base that smelled like hot metal and stopped mid-sentence. I could hear breathing and a radio and then it died, and when he called back he said, "Sorry, Mama, bad connection." I could almost forgive the absence when the calls did reconnect. But one night I woke up and realized the phone hadn't rung in 2 weeks. My heart learned a new shape then, the hollow where a mother keeps vigil. I left notes on the kitchen counter, folded like small white flags. Michael, call me when you're free. I baked his favorite lemon squares and froze them in case he came home unexpectedly. Expecting someone who doesn't come home is a small, steady pain. If you're listening to this and you haven't yet hit subscribe, please do it now. This is where the story gets sharp and the truth begins to unfold. When he first mentioned PTSD, he used it like a shield and a reason. Mama, some days it's just loud in my head, he told me in a call that sounded like he was talking through cotton. I'm doing therapy through the unit. I have people. Don't worry. I wanted to trust him the way a mother trusts her child. But worry is a practical thing, it makes you keep lists and keep records and keep trying. So I tried, the way mothers do. I called his unit's number, polite at first, and when they told me they couldn't disclose anything I wrote to the chaplain and to the family liaison and asked for help. I learned how to fill out forms that I used to think were just for taxes and insurance. I learned how to send emails that said, please check on my son. He posted about nightmares. I learned to use a different language to ask for the same thing, mercy. You learn to use language like a toolbox when you have to. For a while, the calls came back in fits and starts. He would call from the middle of a night watch and read to me from a magazine to stop thinking about things he couldn't say. He would apologize for the long silences and tell me he loved me. But then, as the tours stacked up and the years thickened, the calls became fewer. I remember the hollow sensation of sitting with the receiver in my hand and listening to the dial tone like it was some kind of clock counting down. One afternoon after a storm, there was a voicemail. Just a clipped, formal voice message that said the base had moved units, that family calls were being routed through a different system. They gave a number. I called that number until my finger grew numb. The recording said to leave a message, that they would forward urgent matters to the family liaison. So I left messages about the nightmares, the flashbacks, the times he had said he couldn't sleep because of noises that sounded like helicopters even when the street was quiet. I asked them to check on him. I asked them to let him know his mother was worried. I even told them the names of the songs that soothed him when he was 5, silly, petty things that might anchor him to simpler times. Weeks passed. Then months. When I say the calls stopped, I mean they evaporated. No postcards, no letters, no mama, I'll be home next month. I started to look for patterns in the silence. I called his unit's public number and asked, and they told me what they always told me, we'll pass your messages along. The family liaison said the same, we'll follow up next week. My mailbox gathered promotional flyers and election notices but no letters from my boy. When I went to the VA clinic for a routine checkup, the social worker there looked at me with eyes that knew too many stories and said, quietly, sometimes units restrict communication for security. It's not personal. I wanted to believe it, but there is a kind of logic to abandonment that feels like a slow erasure. You are removed in layers until you're a footnote in someone else's life. The first real crack came when I found an unfamiliar envelope in the mail months later, thin, official-looking, with a stamp from an international mail system. I expected one of those stiff postcard photos of a desert base. Instead, inside was a short, typed letter from a legal office overseas. It said, in careful English, that for security reasons the soldier involved had requested all personal calls and contact be routed through official channels and that the soldier's next of kin information had been updated. No names were changed. The letter used formal phrases like authorized representative and operational confidentiality. It also included a line that looked like community. For the soldier's privacy and safety, the unit recommends limited direct contact during active deployment. That should have been a sentence that offered reassurance. Instead, it felt like a shutter coming down. I rang the number listed for the family liaison until my hands cramped. I sat in the kitchen with the envelope and the radio playing low, the kind of background noise that keeps a room from feeling like a tomb. The liaison's voicemail told me to register on a portal to get notices. I did. I filled in forms and clicked submit like someone pressing a button that might open a door. I replied to the letter, "Please, my son has PTSD, please check in with him. Tell him his mama worries." I used all my manners and all my pleas. And then I waited. Mothers learn waiting in the quiet way the tide keeps time. We keep sending small light signals out into a world that moves like weather. The months that followed were peppered with small, cutting things, photos on social media of my son in uniform standing tall next to crewmates, a mention in an online article of soldiers supported by a foundation that had nothing to do with me, other mothers who found their sons home for a night posting pictures on community forums while I stared at an empty chair. I felt, without wanting to, like an old radio station whose frequency had drifted. People who had once called me Aunt Martha or looked to me for church quilts now nodded over the fence in that polite way towns do, like they'd seen a sadness and didn't know the edges. I started to wonder if the truth was worse than distance. What if he had simply cut the line himself? What if he no longer wanted me in his story? The thought is a hot, sour thing that sits in your gut. I had given up shifts at the hospital to be at his graduations. I had cooked for him when he was a scrawny teenager. I had attended ceremonies and clapped and cried in the audience. The idea that a son might willingly erase his mother is something that will make you measure every conversation you've ever had and fret over which sentence pushed him further away. But even when your own child seems to forget you, you're still a person with rights and options and friends. You can't be a single story of abandonment forever. Something else begins to take shape. A slow, sharp curiosity that says, let's see why this happened. Let's look closer. That is where this story turns. Not from worry to fury, though there was fury in me, there always is, but from private grief to quiet action. From sitting on the porch and imagining, to moving my feet down the walk and asking hard questions of people who preferred not to answer. From pressing a button and then another, to unspooling the threads of silence until someone notices that the seam has come undone. If you're still listening, please make sure you're subscribed and hit the bell for notifications, because what I did next changed everything. I learned how to use the systems that were supposed to protect soldiers to actually find out how my son was, and why the calls had stopped. I found allies no one expected I'd have, and I discovered a set of facts that were stranger than silence. See, after months of silence, I'd started to believe maybe Michael was too broken to talk. Maybe his guilt or pain kept him quiet. But I couldn't let go of one small, odd thing. The letter I'd received wasn't handwritten. It came from a legal office overseas, but when I looked closely at the header, something about the font, the logo placement, it didn't feel right. You live long enough, you learn how to smell when something's off. So one afternoon, I took that letter down to the VFW hall. My husband had served, and I still had a few old friends there who knew how to read military paperwork. I sat down with a man named Roy Daniels, retired Air Force, half-deaf, all heart. He squinted through his glasses, running a thick finger along the page. Then he stopped. His eyebrows pulled together. "Martha," he said slowly, "this stamp, it's not from a military legal office. It's from a private contractor. A contractor. Not the government. Not the base." That was the first hairline crack in the story I'd been told. I went home with that letter and placed it next to my husband's flag on the mantel. I looked at his picture and whispered, "James, what did we raise him into?" Days passed, but I couldn't rest. I started digging, little by little, calling numbers on the bottom of the letter, pretending I was confused and needed help. One woman told me, "Ma'am, that office handles correspondence for soldiers involved in special assignments. We don't give out personal contact information." Her tone was polite, rehearsed. But there was something in the way she said special assignments, flat, mechanical, final, that made my stomach turn. I tried one last thing. I called a friend of Michael's, someone from his old unit. His name was Darren. He'd been home for 6 months after an injury. He answered my call like he was expecting it. "Mrs. Lee," he said softly, "I was hoping you'd reach out." The air around me went still. "Why?" I asked. "Do you know something about my son?" A pause. A sound like someone lighting a cigarette. Then his voice, lower, guarded. "Ma'am, I shouldn't say much on a line like this. But you didn't hear from him because he wasn't allowed to talk to you." Someone filed an order. I felt my knees go weak. "What do you mean, an order?" "His commanding officer." He stopped himself. "Let's just say, she had influence. She said you were causing him emotional instability. That your calls triggered his PTSD. She told the admin to cut communication. Said it was in his best interest." I couldn't speak. I just held the phone, listening to the static hum like the sound of blood in my ears. "Mrs. Lee," he added, voice trembling now, "Michael didn't know. He thinks you stopped calling." And just like that, my entire world tilted. He didn't ignore me. He thought I abandoned him. If you're still listening, don't move, because what I found out next will make your heart stop. I asked Darren to meet me at a small diner off Route 29. He came limping in, wearing a faded jacket and a look of someone carrying too many ghosts. When he sat down, he slid a folded piece of paper across the table. It was a printed email chain, between Michael's commanding officer, Captain Laureen Ashcroft, and the communications liaison. The subject line read, "Family call restrictions, Private Michael Lee." In that email, she'd written, "Mother continues to call and email daily. For the soldier's stability, recommend blocking all direct contact. Notify family liaison to send standard welfare response." I stared at those words until they blurred. The email was dated the same week I'd left those desperate voicemails begging them to check on him. "She made it sound like you were the problem," Darren said quietly. "But Michael, he worshipped you. She twisted everything." I took that paper home and sat on the porch until dusk. The crickets started their choir, and the world went on like nothing had changed. But inside me, something was burning slow and steady. Grief, yes, but also anger. Cold and focused, like the first edge of a blade being sharpened. I'd been erased from my own son's life by a woman hiding behind authority. She'd silenced me, isolated him, and made me a ghost in my own story. That night, I made a promise to myself. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to beg. I was going to do what my husband taught me back when he fixed radios for the unit: if the signal's jammed, find another frequency. And that's what I did. If you haven't liked this video yet, do it now, because what came next, the things I uncovered, turned my heartbreak into a plan. A slow, careful revenge that no one saw coming. I started by learning who Captain Ashcroft really was. The next day, I drove to the base office, pretending I needed help with Michael's benefits paperwork. I brought cookies, the kind of southern charm that opens doors. While the receptionist stepped away, I leaned forward and peeked at the staff directory on her desk. Captain Laureen Ashcroft, Commanding Officer, Behavioral Support Unit. And next to her name, in partnership with Wellbridge Recovery Consultancy. A contractor. The same name from the fake legal letter. I took a picture of that page. When I got home, I started digging online. Public records, news archives, anything. And there she was, smiling in an article about family boundaries in soldier rehabilitation. She'd been praised for her tough love approach, keeping soldiers focused by limiting external emotional disruptions. External emotional disruptions. That's what she called mothers. You ever have one of those moments where every lie suddenly lines up perfectly, like puzzle pieces you wish you hadn't found? That was mine. She had built an entire career off controlling communication, and she'd used my son as another case study. By the time I closed my laptop, the kitchen clock was ticking louder than it ever had. I whispered to the empty house, "You chose the wrong mother to silence." Because now, I had a name. I had proof. And I had nothing left to lose. And if you think that's where the story ends, oh no, that's where my revenge began. After I found Captain Ashcroft's email and the contractor's name, I felt something I hadn't felt since James died, a steadiness that wasn't exhaustion. The kind of calm that happens when you decide you won't be erased. I had the paper that said they cut me out. I had the emails that made it plain. What I didn't have, yet, was a way to prove motive. People hide behind authority, they stitch their words into policy and call it duty. So I began the slow, careful work of turning suspicion into evidence. First, I organized everything. I am a woman who scheduled hospital rooms and patient appointments for 30 years, I know how to keep records. I bought a little accordion folder, labeled tabs, dates, calls, letters, emails, witnesses, media. I printed the email chains Darren had given me and put them in the first section. I wrote down dates the liaison had told me they'd check, and the days I'd left messages. For every "will follow up" answer I'd been given, I had a time and a name. I'm telling you, paper is a truth teller if you treat it like one. Then I went to work finding witnesses. I called Darren and asked if he'd be willing to talk on record. He said yes, though his voice wavered when he spoke of Michael. "She made it sound like you weren't stable," he told me once, and I felt anger like a hard sun. He agreed to give a written statement about what he'd heard and how Michael had been before the restrictions began. He wasn't the only one. A neighbor in the barracks, private, gruff, the kind of man who didn't talk much, said he'd seen Captain Ashcroft pull Michael aside during an off-base leave and speak to him in a tone that looked coercive. He'd thought it was official concern, until later. He agreed to an affidavit. Little by little, people who had been quiet stepped forward when I asked gently and told what they'd seen. You learn an important thing: some people just need permission to speak. They want to be helpful, but they're afraid of the consequences. So I listened in the way I used to listen to anxious patients in the hospital, with a calm face and an open hand. When people told me things, I wrote them down exactly. You'd be amazed how many little truths add up. Next, I used the system that had been used against me. If Captain Ashcroft operated under the auspices of a contractor, there are rules about contractors, oversight, and accountability. I started calling the contractor listed on that fake letter, Wellbridge Recovery Consultancy. Official sounding, corporate. I asked for their compliance office. The receptionist transferred me twice, then once to voicemail. I left a message. I'm calling about possible misuse of family contact procedures, I said. I kept my voice even. The person who answered called me back later that week, no apologies, just a formal tone and a promise that they'd look into our records and report back within 2 weeks. I filed that voicemail. Variety of evidence. Because I wanted them to see I meant business, I also reached out to the base's Inspector General. That's the office that exists in most military installations for complaints, for oversight, for when the normal chain of command might be compromised. I wrote a formal complaint, short, factual, with dates and names and the email chain attached. The IG's office asked for copies and said they'd open a case if they found merit. I felt the slow, bureaucratic machine start to turn. Bureaucracy is not sexy, but it's a tool. It has teeth when you feed it truth. I began speaking to people who knew how to make truth loud. I called a journalist that Darren recommended, not the kind that feeds on scandal, but the kind who does public service reporting. I told her I had evidence of improper restrictions of family contact imposed on a deployed soldier by a contractor in collusion with a commanding officer. She asked sharp questions and wanted documents. I mailed her copies and left them with the heading, for review, potential abuse of authority. She didn't promise a headline. But she promised she'd look. I learned to respect that kind of quiet power, someone who holds a pen like a lantern. Meanwhile, I needed to get to Michael. That was the heart of everything. All the emails in the world wouldn't fix a boy who thought his mother had walked away. The IG process moves slow, it takes time. And time can mean a man's silence solidifies into a habit. I began to consider the small ways a person can be reached where the system cannot block. I thought of families groups, of veterans networks, of churches and communities. I went back to the VFW. I told Roy everything I knew. He listened, and when I finished he put an old hand on mine and said, "We'll get him back, Martha. Soldiers don't stay ghosts if their people look for them." We started with a quiet pressure campaign. Not to bully, not to shame, but to create a chorus. Roy called other vets who'd known James. The pastor from our church, the one who'd married James and me, called his contacts at the VA and asked if anyone would check in with known contacts on deployment listings. A pattern of small calls, friendly letters, and quiet inquiries began to ripple through the networks that Captain Ashcroft thought were isolated. When enough people ask questions, an institution starts to notice. And then I did something I'd never seen myself do. I used the one thing Captain Ashcroft had weaponized, rules, against her. I filed a Freedom of Information Act request. It's not glamorous. It's not fast. But FOIA asks the government to give records. I requested communications about Private Michael Lee between the base and Wellbridge for a defined period. The request had to be specific, with dates and document types. I submitted it online at midnight, hands freezing from the cold and determination. Filing that FOIA was like dropping a stone in a pond. You don't see the ripples immediately, but they come. A month later, a clerk emailed me to say they had found responsive documents and that some material might be withheld under privacy or operational security exemptions. She asked for more specificity. We narrowed. I worked with my attorney friend, a woman from church who owed me favors and knew how to parse redactions, and we honed the request until the base had to respond with something substantial. I learned to love paperwork the way others love novellas. There's a satisfaction in crafting a precise request. The turning point came when the journalist I'd spoken to wrote a piece about the rise of private contractors in soldier rehabilitation and the risks when oversight is lax. She did not name names at first, that's not safe or fair, but she quoted the pattern, contractors recommending limiting family contact without clear oversight. The story was careful, it was researched, and it brought attention. People with power don't love attention. The article made the IG office move faster. The FOIA opened a door for the IG to ask for documents they might otherwise have let sit. That's when the small, private things I'd collected began to look like a shape. The email Captain Ashcroft wrote recommending I be blocked was one thing. The contractor's internal memo noting, families cause instability in X% cases, was another. Together they made a strategy, isolate, control, justify. And I had those documents, I had the dates, the witnesses, and the chain. But the hardest part was the personal one, convincing my son that he hadn't been abandoned. I could take the court and the IG and the press as far as I needed, but without Michael's heart I had nothing sweet to reclaim. So I found a back channel, a family liaison in another base who had heard quietly from someone there that Michael was being flagged for special assignment, a classification that often means a soldier is assigned tasks that keep them from regular leave and sometimes isolate them more than usual. The liaison, after seeing parts of my file and seeing the FOIA reference, agreed to try a welfare check under a non-operational pretext. She did it quietly, the kind of mercy that is administrative and gentle. The welfare check happened on a Tuesday afternoon when the base was dull and the heat made metal breathe. A week later, Darren called me. "Mrs. Lee," he said, voice thick, "I saw Michael. He cried in my arms. He thought you'd stopped calling because you didn't care anymore. He thought he had no right to be your burden." I could feel my throat pinched. I told him the truth, Darren said. I told him you never stopped. But that captain had convinced him the calls were hurting him. I told him the portal had been cut. He is so sorry. It took everything in me not to drive to the base that minute. Instead, I did the smart thing, I wrote him a letter. No accusations, no speeches. Just the ordinary things that anchor a person. Son, Mama is here. I sent you your lemon squares recipe. I remember when you painted the fence and painted my boots with blue. I'm proud of you, and I never stopped loving you. I mailed it with a tracking number and an email copy to the liaison marked for immediate welfare delivery. I wanted him to read my voice in print, to feel my hands in the words. He called 3 days after he got it. The voice that came through was not the tight, machine-muted thing I'd heard over the years. It was a man, raw, ashamed, and small. Mama, he said, I thought you left. I thought you had given up on me. I felt the years collapse like a worn blanket. I'd never give up on you, I answered, voice steady. Someone lied to you, Michael. He wept in a way that makes you young again and old at the same time. We spoke for an hour. He told me about Captain Ashcroft's calm voice, about the way she'd framed my calls as agitation triggers. He told me the contractor had sent forms that seemed official and that the admin had followed procedure. He told me his shame had been so heavy he thought silence was the only gift he could give me. I didn't yell. I didn't scold. I held him in my words. We'll fix this together, I told him. We'll clean up the paperwork. We'll tell the truth. He agreed, quiet and trembling. Mama, I'm so sorry. And in that moment, the long winter of my waiting began to thaw. If you're still here with me, hit like and subscribe, because what follows is not cheap triumph. It's the slow, complicated work of undoing a power that thought it could silence a mother. It's about how systems get corrected and how people, even those who have authority, are held accountable when ordinary people refuse to be invisible. After I realized Captain Ashcroft had deliberately silenced me, something inside me shifted. For years, I had been patient. For years, I had written letters, left voicemails, and waited by the phone. But patience is a quiet fire, it doesn't always burn outward, but when it does, it consumes the coldest structures. I spent days on my porch staring at the old Virginia maples swaying in the wind, thinking. My heart was heavy with relief that Michael was alive, that he hadn't turned against me, but it was also full of a rage that made my hands shake. Rage like that is a teacher. It tells you what matters. It tells you who has stepped on you and why you must respond. I started by writing down every moment I had been silenced, the emails, the forged letters, the official orders, the contractors, and Captain Ashcroft herself. I filled pages with dates, names, and the impact on Michael. But writing was not enough. I wanted her to feel the weight of what she'd done, not through bureaucracy, not through lawyers, but through something she could not ignore. The first step was finding her. Not the office, not the emails, her. I went to the social events where she appeared publicly, military fundraisers, speaking engagements about soldier stability, and panels on family influence. I watched her move, the self-assured smile she carried like armor. And I realized something important, people who wield authority like a weapon are often scared of exposure. They are meticulous, but they are also human. I decided I would confront her where it mattered. I sent a formal RSVP to an event she was hosting, under the pretext of being a concerned parent whose child had benefited from her programs. The planners accepted without question. That night, I dressed carefully. Not too formal, but enough to be noticed. My hands were steady even as my pulse thumped like a drum. Michael knew nothing, he had no idea I was about to walk into the lair of the woman who had tried to erase me. When I entered the room, she was speaking to a small audience, her voice smooth, practiced. I felt a moment of hesitation, an instinctive flutter that almost made me turn around. But then I remembered every letter she had intercepted, every call she had blocked, every tear Michael had shed thinking I didn't care. My chest tightened. I walked forward. She saw me coming and froze for a moment, just a flicker, before replacing it with her carefully maintained composure. I could see the calculation in her eyes, and I knew she recognized me. The woman who had tried to erase me had met her first opponent, a mother armed with truth and fury. I waited until her talk ended. The crowd began to disperse, and I approached. "Captain Ashcroft," I said, my voice calm but cutting. She turned fully toward me, and there was the faintest tensing of her shoulders. "May I have a word?" My tone was polite, controlled, but underneath it was the weight of years of silenced sorrow. "Of course," she replied, her smile tight. We moved to a quieter corner. I let silence linger for a moment, letting her feel it, before I spoke. "You decided to cut my son off from me. You lied, manipulated, and used your authority to make him believe his mother abandoned him. Do you understand what that means?" Her eyes flickered. A micro-expression, gone before the next second. She opened her mouth, but I didn't let her speak. "I want you to understand the human cost. Not just paperwork or policy, the nights he spent crying into his pillow, the letters I never got, the meals I baked for him that he never tasted. That is the result of your actions." She swallowed. "Mrs. Lee, Do not speak," I said, softer now, but every word a hammer strike. "I want you to feel it. I want you to know that I am not a ghost in my son's life. I am here. I am seeing you now. And I will make sure this truth is known, not because I am cruel, but because justice doesn't come silently when power is misused." Her carefully curated mask cracked slightly. I could see it. People who spend years controlling others aren't prepared for confrontation that doesn't panic, doesn't beg, doesn't flinch. They expect fear, they expect confusion. They do not expect steady, calm, and resolute truth delivered by someone who has nothing left to lose. I pulled out a folder, the emails, the contractor's memos, the copies of letters Darren and the neighbor had given me. These are records. All of them. You cannot argue that you were unaware of the consequences. You silenced a mother. You isolated a young man from his family. And you will be held accountable. Her breath hitched, the first human sound she made that was not rehearsed. She glanced at the documents, her hands trembling ever so slightly. I didn't stop, because mothers like me learn that hesitation gives those who hurt others a chance to rebuild their walls. "You will correct the records. You will reinstate my son's contact. You will acknowledge the interference. And I will be telling the world what you've done if these steps are not taken." The color drained slightly from her face. I left her there, in the quiet corner, with the papers splayed like a mirror showing her own reflection. I walked out of that room with my head held high, feeling the first taste of power in years. Not revenge in the petty sense, real, righteous action. Emotional, yes. Dramatic, yes. But grounded in the unassailable truth. And that night, when I returned home, Michael called me. His voice cracked, thick with relief and disbelief. "Mama, you faced her." "I did," I whispered, smiling through the tears. "And I'll face anyone who tries to erase us." I sat in my kitchen, listening to his voice over the phone, and I realized something. Revenge is not always about anger. Sometimes it's about reclaiming what is yours, confronting the fear, and showing that no one, can take your place in your child's life. Stay tuned, because the next part is where the consequences of that confrontation ripple outward. Captain Ashcroft's career, the contractor, the base, none of it will remain untouched. And the truth about a mother's strength will be undeniable. The first step was controlled exposure. I drafted an email to the local military news outlet. Carefully worded. Not vindictive. Not emotional. Just facts. I attached copies of the emails, the memos, the contractor documentation. I highlighted the pattern: isolation, falsified legal claims, deliberate interference in family communication. Then I waited. That was the hardest part. Waiting while the story got traction. Waiting while the IG began their internal review. Waiting while Michael's name was cleared of any supposed instability the captain had claimed. But waiting doesn't mean I was still. I arranged a second, more personal confrontation. This time, I went to her office, where she couldn't hide behind speeches or a polished audience. I knocked, and she looked up, startled to see me again. "Martha Lee," she said, voice tight, almost clipped. "I came to deliver something," I said, sliding the folder across her desk. The weight of all the proof inside was enough to sink ships. "It's time to face the consequences of silencing a mother." Her hands shook as she picked up the documents. She tried to hide it behind a calm, mechanical voice, but the tremor in her fingers gave her away. You can't just." "I can," I said, steady, looking her dead in the eyes. "And I will. You thought you could erase me. But I'm here. Michael's here. The proof is here. And people will know." The next day, the story went public. The journalist I'd contacted published a careful, investigative piece detailing how contractors and officers had overstepped, isolating soldiers from their families under the guise of stability. The article didn't name Michael at first, but the evidence was irrefutable. Within hours, it was trending in military family groups, online forums, and local news. I watched Captain Ashcroft's face on a recorded panel that evening. She tried to project authority, but now her expression was taut, defensive, the armor cracking. I could almost hear her internal panic as the emails I had collected and documented were cited in multiple follow-ups. The contractor issued a vague statement promising review of procedures, but I knew it was too little, too late. Meanwhile, I focused on Michael. I called him every night, slowly rebuilding our bond. No rush. Just me, him, and the truth. The letters I'd written years ago, which had been ignored or intercepted, became symbols of what we'd endured, and what we had survived. Then came the cascade of consequences. Captain Ashcroft's superiors launched an internal investigation. The FOIA requests I had submitted forced the release of internal communications. The contractor faced scrutiny from oversight boards. People who thought they could play with lives like pieces on a chessboard were suddenly on the defensive. And Michael, watching him slowly smile again, see him reclaim the joy of speaking to his mother freely, it was a revenge I couldn't have imagined. Not bitterness. Not anger. But justice served through truth, exposure, and reclaiming what had been stolen. There were tense moments, of course. Emails challenging my claims. Calls from lawyers threatening action. But I was ready. Every page, every record, every witness testimony was filed and documented. I had turned silence into evidence, and the power of the truth could not be denied. At one point, Captain Ashcroft tried to contact me privately. I ignored her. She called again. I recorded the voicemail. She tried emailing. I forwarded everything to the journalist, to the IG, and kept copies for Michael. Every attempt she made to regain control only strengthened the case against her. Then the final act of public reckoning happened, a press conference held by the IG. I was there quietly, seated in the back, holding Michael's hand. They announced findings of misconduct, confirming that Captain Ashcroft had unlawfully restricted family communications and that the contractor had misrepresented authority in emails and letters. The official statement concluded with actions to restore Michael's contact rights and a warning of administrative consequences for the officer. I felt a warmth in my chest, an ache of relief and triumph together. But the most powerful moment came when I turned to Michael, and he whispered, "You did this for me?" "I did," I said, tears streaming. "I did it because I love you. And because no one silences a mother." That night, we went home. I cooked dinner, something ordinary, roast chicken and mashed potatoes, Michael's favorite. For the first time in years, we sat at the table together without the weight of lies or distance. The world outside could rage, politics could shuffle, the contractors could try to hide, but inside our house, truth and love had reclaimed their place. And that, my friends, is the real power of revenge. Not petty grudges. Not anger. But standing up, exposing truth, and reclaiming life and family from those who tried to erase it. If you're still watching, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because stories like this, stories of mothers, truth, and courage, are worth being heard. And trust me, the aftermath has lessons that will stick with you forever. Captain Ashcroft was reassigned to a desk position far from deployment commands. Her carefully constructed authority crumbled under scrutiny, and the contractor faced fines and a review of its practices. I watched it all unfold from my little living room, feeling a satisfaction that was calm and deep, not vindictive, just right. Justice had been served, measured and undeniable. Michael came home that weekend. The sound of the front door closing behind him felt like a bell ringing in a quiet cathedral. We didn't need words at first. He hugged me, tight, as if trying to compress years of distance into a single moment. Tears rolled freely, and I let them. I had spent too long holding grief in, and now I could let it pour into the warmth of reunion. We talked for hours that night, recalling lost birthdays, missed dinners, and stolen conversations. Every story he told me of the base, of the moments he had felt lost and alone, I listened, letting him know he was heard. I told him the truth, too, how I had discovered the lies, how I had planned to confront the woman who silenced us, and how I had carefully built the path for justice. "You were brave, Mama," he said finally, voice low and shaking. "I thought you'd given up on me. I thought I'd lost you." "You never lost me," I whispered. "Not for a second. And now you know, no one can take our bond away." It wasn't just revenge that had healed us. It was reclaiming the truth, standing up against deception, and proving that love is stronger than any authority or manipulation. The lessons weren't just for Captain Ashcroft or the contractor. They were for Michael, for me, and for anyone listening, that silence can be broken, that power can be challenged, and that courage matters even when it feels impossible. I kept writing, of course. Letters, emails, notes in the margins of the old photo albums. Not for anyone else, but for us. Each one a marker of victory, of survival, of reclaiming the time and connection that had been stolen. Sometimes, when the evening sun falls across our porch, and Michael is inside working on his own projects, I sit quietly and remember the long, painful months. The waiting, the uncertainty, the grief. And I smile softly, because I know something powerful, even when the world tries to erase you, even when lies pile up like walls, the truth will always find a way through. And that, my friends, is the final lesson. Never underestimate a mother's love. Never underestimate the persistence of truth. And never believe that silence can last forever when courage chooses to speak. So if you've been with me until the end, I thank you from the bottom of my heart. Like this video, subscribe, and share this story, because someone out there may be waiting to hear that no matter how lost they feel, no one can take away what's truly theirs.